behind the lace and lilies. Someone's secret turned fatal. Welcome to Mystery Parlour. I am your host, Axon. Your comments make this even better. Where are you watching from today? I can't wait to see where everyone is tuning in from. Let's uncover the truth. On a certain Thursday in late May, Flaxborough looked particularly pleased with itself. The high street, swept by the conscientious lads from the borough council, smelled faintly of paraffin, soap, and optimism. The flower and produce show was due to open at 3 o'clock in the Memorial Hall, and Mrs. Isabel Grinnell, chairwoman of the Ladies' Horticultural Circle and self-appointed guardian of civic elegance, had taken her morning tea with a serene conviction that all would proceed in the manner of her own household, properly, punctually, and under supervision. At 2:30, however, Mrs. Grinnell's serenity was gently perforated. The first hint of discord came from the committee room, where the cucumber sandwiches were being unwrapped. Mrs. Grinnell, who distrusted cling film almost as much as foreigners, was inspecting the arrangement of napkins when Miss Vining, the vicar's secretary, entered with the dazed expression of someone who had just seen the Holy Spirit, or something rather less expected. "Mrs. Grinnell," Miss Vining whispered, though her whisper carried with admirable efficiency. "Mrs. Pettingill's entry for the floral arts section is not as it was." Mrs. Grinnell turned, the lace collar of her ivory blouse stiff with foreboding. "Not as it was?" Miss Vining nodded gravely. "It's been interfered with. Quite altered." They advanced together into the hall, where the displays stood in rows like nervous debutantes. There, on the polished oak table marked Class 14, Wedding Arrangements, lay Mrs. Pettingill's pride, a bouquet fashioned of white roses, lilies, and sprigs of maidenhair fern, all tastefully set in a silver epergne. Only now, instead of the harmonious composition that had occupied her all night, the central bloom had been replaced by a rather startling artificial carnation of a lurid purple hue. The effect was not merely aesthetic. To Mrs. Grinnell, it was moral. By the time Mrs. Pettingill herself arrived, breathless, powdered, and already cross, half the town committee was gathered round the display. "It's a joke," she declared, voice trembling between outrage and triumph, as though the desecration itself might prove her importance. "A deliberate, spiteful joke, and I know who's behind it." There was a small, expectant silence. Mrs. Grinnell adjusted her gloves and prepared herself to receive the name like a confession. But before Mrs. Pettingill could speak, a sharp cry arose from the corner where the teas were being arranged. Someone had dropped a tray, or so it seemed. But when the crowd turned, they saw Mrs. Wykes, the church organist, standing with both hands to her mouth and eyes, fixed upon the small door leading to the cloakroom. "Someone's in there," she whispered. "On the floor?" And indeed there was. Inspector Purbright, summoned from the station a quarter of an hour later, found himself standing in that same narrow passage, hat in hand, while Sergeant Love and the local constable conferred in low tones. The body, female, middle-aged, immaculately dressed in ivory lace and pearls, lay with one arm crooked beneath her, as though she had been arranging her own repose. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. Only a faint scent of lilac water and the curious fact that her hat was missing. Purbright gazed thoughtfully at the floor where a single petal of purple silk had caught on the heel of her shoe. "Well," he said mildly, "it appears Mrs. Grinnell's show will be remembered after all." The hall's hush dissolved as if someone had lifted a glass dome. Voices slipped into that respectful murmur which travels farther than shouting, and the talk ran ahead of facts with the bright impatience of schoolchildren. Mrs. Grinnell, converting shock into procedure, announced that nobody was to move, which induced everybody to bustle in small, obedient circles. She then began, with admirable futility, to rearrange the napkins. Sergeant Love placed a constable at the cloakroom door and, by simply existing, caused half the committee to remember sudden errands elsewhere. Purbright remained where he was, hat in hand, gazing at the corridor floor as though listening for whatever it had lately heard. By 3, the memorial hall had become a machine for producing statements. Mrs. Pettingill, quivering like aspic, told Miss Vining that malice had haunted the exhibit since breakfast and that her bouquet's violation merely proved, as she had always said, that floral art encouraged theatricality in the morally susceptible. Some people, she concluded, cannot leave a wedding alone. Miss Vining, who believed suffering should be dressed in quiet colors, wondered if it were unchristian to hope the deceased had at least seen the joke. She decided it was unchristian and told 3 people so, who agreed devoutly. Mr. Coble, fishmonger and annual donor of potted shrimp to the cause of culture, declared the lady must be Mrs. Dalrymple of the drapery, since he had once seen her in lace of identical disposition. Mrs. Coble improved on this by pointing out that while the lace was practically Dalrymple, the pearls were certainly not, and, moreover, Mrs. Dalrymple avoided church floors since a childhood incident with linseed oil. A third authority, fortified by spectators, proposed the school secretary. He had never seen her in lace, but felt she would wear it in principle, which was often worse. Identity, having been settled 3 ways, remained uncertain. In the committee room, a resolution circulated in the form of a teapot. Sympathy first, sugar second. Mrs. Wykes, hands fluttering like music without. Notation told the vicar she had heard a sound that was not a tray, though how a tray did sound when it was not itself, she could not say. The vicar, who wore pastoral calm like a respirator against municipal crises, agreed that Providence moved in many ways, some of which were regulations, and went in search of a notice forbidding distress. He found one advising the proper stacking of chairs, which seemed almost as useful. Purbright, meanwhile, learned that the reticule beside the body contained a mirror, coin purse, and a small card case marked E.S. Plain Roman letters, stubbornly unromantic. He conveyed this to the committee and watched 3 faces recognize the initials and then retreat from their own knowledge like swimmers from cold water. Love, at his elbow, murmured that Miss Edna Swan of Fountain Lane, millinery and notions, had rehearsed the wedding display 2 nights ago and was reputed to have opinions about lace that could injure without leaving a mark. Purbright nodded as if at weather. Interesting, seldom decisive on its own. By 3:30, Flaxborough possessed the following truths. The bouquet had been tampered with. A respectable woman lay dead without spectacle. Miss Swan had recently held a key to the hall, and somebody's hat was missing. Truths were enjoyed because they implied membership. On the high street, word gathered colour as it passed from grocer to greengrocer, from girls with bicycles to ladies with purposes. The chemist's assistant remembered selling smelling salts that morning to a woman in Ivory. 2 schoolgirls reported, with the invincible authority of youth, that Miss Swan had once turned away a councillor's wife for wanting feathers in the wrong month. The caretaker, Mr. Blee, stumped up from the boiler's warm philosophies to explain that the hall had been opened at 10 and again at 1, that he had inspected the cloakroom at noon when a lady with a hat box required a shelf, and that he himself had never trusted artificial flowers, believing them implicated in moth. He could not speak to the missing hat, which distressed him by failing to be his responsibility. He had, however, noticed a new sort of scent in the corridor shortly after lunch. Younger than it ought to be, he said, with the affronted air of a man whose nostrils had been imposed upon. Purbright returned to the vandalized bouquet. The purple silk carnation, absurd as a smirk in church, had been set deftly, not thrust. Whoever placed it knew how to keep stems obedient. "You can make an honest bloom look theatrical," he murmured, by seating it next to a lyre. Love, who disliked sociology and sentences, asked whether the carnation came from any exhibit. It had not. There were traces of floral tape not used elsewhere on the table, and a faint tang of scent that did not belong to lilies or roses. The inspector's glance, mild as a librarian's, wandered to the corridor where the single purple petal clung to the dead woman's heel like a too-forward calling card. It spared them trouble when Miss Swan arrived of her own accord, brisk and unescorted. She regarded the constable, the arranged sorrow of the committee, and Purbright's courtly gravity, then performed a small nod that implied she had been expecting all three. "If the initials are mine," she said, glancing at the reticule, "I hope the money is still the Queen's." "We are sorry to trouble you," Purbright replied. "We are accounting for keys, hats, and small injustices." Miss Swan said she had borrowed a key when Mrs. Wykes mislaid hers and returned it last night to the committee box. As for hats, she had left a sensible ivory felt at noon and found it gone at 2. She had decided a scene was dearer than the hat. "You knew the deceased?" Purbright asked. "I sold her lace," Miss Swan said, "and restraint when I could. She preferred lace." Love inquired whether she had seen anyone near the cloakroom. "A few people near themselves," Miss Swan said. "Mrs. Pettingill in search of applause, the caretaker with a key-weighted conscience, and a lady whose perfume was rather young for her taste going by swiftly." Purbright considered the absence where a hat should have been. Hats are declarations of belonging. To steal one is to revise a person's sentence. "Who else used this corridor between 1 and 2? He asked generally. It appeared that everyone had almost used it. Mrs. Grinnell supervising napkins, Mr. Blee adjusting drafts, Mrs. Pettingill floating with genius, the organist fetching a hymn list no one could later locate. Each account contained no guilt and a pinch of importance. There was a thud. Mrs. Wykes remembered again, more exact now that remembrance was fashionable. Like a parcel put down firmly. I thought it was cucumber pride. "Thank you," Purbright said, and the corridor relaxed by an inch. He asked that the hall be cleared of all but those the law could plausibly call essential. People withdrew backwards, leaving their conjectures standing like umbrellas. When the place was quieter, he went back into the cloakroom. The body lay where decency had encouraged it to lie, with no violence except the final kind. On the heel of one shoe the torn silk petal clung, a tiny, careless heraldry. He bent as if to listen to it, then straightened and very softly asked Love to discover whether any local shop sold purple silk carnations and whether any lady known to prefer lilac water had lately chosen a younger scent. Outside, Flaxborough's murmur continued, industrious as bees, honeyed, busy, and not always reliable about flowers. At dusk, the memorial hall surrendered its heat to the evening, and the air beyond the police cordon carried the mild, complicated odor of cut flowers, varnish, and inquiry. The body had been removed with discretion, which in Flaxborough meant both doors open and eyes wider still. Mrs. Grinnell, pale but determined, declared that the show would be suspended pending decorum. This, in her mind, sounded resolute without being vulgar. Sergeant Love oversaw the dispersal of the crowd, and then, with a sigh that betrayed experience, found Inspector Purbright still in the cloakroom doorway, regarding an empty hook with the expression of someone listening to an old tune he could not quite place. "Nothing else missing, sir," Love reported. "Only the hat." Purbright nodded, his gaze following the faint scuff on the linoleum. "Only the hat," he echoed, as if it were a title in a catalogue. "A curious theft, Sergeant. Hats don't fetch much on the black market of sentiment." They stepped outside into the cooling dusk, where the faint hum of gossip could be heard rising from the nearby tea shops. Every window seemed to possess a head behind its lace curtain, every street lamp a witness. The inspector's first call was on the police surgeon, Dr. Hilling, who was concluding his preliminary notes at the small mortuary behind the surgery. Hilling was a man who approached death as an administrative inconvenience and conversation, as a stimulant to digestion. "No violence," he said briskly, as Purbright leaned over the neat, still figure now properly tagged as Edna Swan. "Heart failure, perhaps, but not the kind that asks politely first. More of a sudden internal betrayal. No bruise, no break, no real protest. Just stopped. Natural? Purbright inquired softly. Possibly, though the face tells a little story. Slight flush, pupils uneven. Something irritated her system. Chemical or emotional, take your pick. But yes, sudden. Purbright nodded. Any scent of perfume still noticeable? Lilac water and something sharper underneath, said Hilling. You've the nose for nuance. Smelled it yourself, I expect. Indeed, and the artificial flower. Hilling gestured to a small envelope on his desk. That wretched purple thing. Clean enough, but the stalk sticky. Trace of resin mixed with something oily. Not glue shop sort of stuff, mind you. Almost cosmetic. Purbright thanked him and stepped out into the late evening light. The town was settling back into its habits, the butcher closing his shutters, the last of the school children weaving homeward. Yet behind the calm, he felt the faint tremor of speculation. Flaxborough was happiest when politely scandalized. He turned toward Fountain Lane. Miss Swan's millinery shop, who still shuttered, displayed in its window a modest collection of hats arranged with symmetrical piety. A faded card read, "Elegance for all occasions, by appointment and good taste." He paused, studying the display. 2 white hats, 1 beige, and a curious space where something had evidently been removed. The faintest dust ring on the velvet stand suggested a recent absence. Love arrived behind him with a sort of cautious enthusiasm reserved for small discoveries. "Sir, the florist's apprentice remembers selling purple silk carnations yesterday afternoon. Says a lady ordered one, just the one, wrapped separately. Paid in coin, no name. He remembers because it was an odd color for spring." Did he describe her? Middle-aged, tidy gloves, light coat, might fit half the town. Purbright smiled slightly. Then half the town will feel useful. Let's oblige them. The following morning began with drizzle, which suited both the streets and the investigation. Purbright walked to the station early, stopping first at the cafe on the corner where conversation came free with every cup. The customers, 3 retired clerks and a widow, fell respectfully silent as he entered, then resumed at once with fresh material. He heard Mrs. Pettingill's name paired with words like jealousy, committee politics, and that time with the chrysanthemums. He let the gossip run ahead of him as a beater flushes out more than the intended game. At the station, Love had compiled a list of everyone who possessed keys to the memorial hall. Mrs. Grinnell, the vicar, Mr. Blee, and 2 committee ladies, one of them Mrs. Pettingill herself. All respectable sorts, Love said, meaning they would require more care than sense. Respectable people, Purbright said thoughtfully, leave their fingerprints on propriety rather than furniture. We'll start there. They visited Mrs. Grinnell first. She received them in a parlor that smelled faintly of lavender polish and quiet triumph. Her lace collar was immaculate, her grief administrative. "It is simply dreadful," she said. Edna Swan was efficient. I wouldn't call her warm. She was not the kind to faint, you know, though she did have a way of correcting one's hat angle. Purbright's expression was sympathetic, yet his questions landed like dust on a shelf, light, persistent, and certain to accumulate. "Did she quarrel with anyone recently?" Mrs. Grinnell pursed her lips. "Not exactly quarrel. There was an exchange of opinions over the placement of Class 14. Mrs. Pettingill felt her arrangement should have occupied the center table, but Miss Swan argued for symmetry. You see how things can begin." "Indeed. And the whole key. In the committee box, as always. Though I understand Mrs. Wykes borrowed it Wednesday evening. Music practice." As they left, Love muttered, "They're all tripping over their own alibis." "Precisely," said Purbright. "It saves us the effort of pushing them." They found Mrs. Wykes at the church, playing something wistful and not entirely certain of its key. She turned from the organ with watery eyes. "Such a gentle woman," she said of Miss Swan. "Always smelled faintly of talc and—" What's that flower? Lilac. Yet she'd taken to stronger perfumes lately. Said it made her feel younger. I dare say it did. Purbright thanked her and examined the key she returned, a brass one, clean but faintly scented with that same youthful fragrance. When they stepped outside, Love wrinkled his nose. Bit sharp, that perfume. More for the dance floor than the church. Purbright's eyes softened, but his mind did not. Yes, and I rather think our victim was not the only lady wearing it. He paused at the gate, listening to the drizzle pattering on the graves. Somewhere behind the polite facades of Flaxborough, a woman had taken another's hat, another's perfume, and perhaps, by small miscalculation, another's life. The difference between ridicule and tragedy, he reflected, was often measured in milligrams. "Sergeant," he said at last, "let's make discreet inquiries at the chemist's. Ask about recent purchases. Perfume oils, tonics, anything that promises youth without delivering it. I suspect Miss Swan's killer was not trying to kill anyone, only to improve herself." The chemist's shop stood between the haberdashers and a shuttered tobacconist, smelling faintly of camphor and other moral tonics. Its proprietor, Mr. Lidicott, possessed that sleek caution peculiar to men who know every ailment in town, but cannot profitably name any. When Purbright and Love entered, he appeared at once, polishing his spectacles on a handkerchief already exhausted by such duties. "Good morning, Inspector. A pity about poor Miss Swan. Such a tidy customer. Always paid in sixpences and asked for her change in silence. How may I be of service?" Purbright smiled with the mildness that disarmed the wary. "We're making a small study of certain purchases. Perfumes, perhaps? Or cosmetic preparations. I wonder if any of your lady clients have lately developed a preference for novelty and scent." Lidicott's eyebrows rose like shutters at dawn. "Novelty, sir, is rarely kind to the complexion, but yes, there's been some interest. A new line, Parfum Jeune, a Paris imitation, strong but harmless. Several of the town ladies tried it. Would Miss Swan be among them? She took a bottle last month, said it was for display, not personal use. And Mrs. Pettingill, if I recall, bought some last week. It comes with a complimentary sachet of lavender to soften the blow." He smiled weakly, aware that levity near death sounded unwholesome. Purbright's head inclined slightly. "A generous touch. Might we see one of the bottles?" The chemist fetched a small square vial with a gilt label. The inspector unstopped it delicately and sniffed. The scent emerged like an impertinent remark. Youthful, artificial, and faintly oily. Beneath it lingered the whisper of something medicinal. "Thank you," Purbright said, stoppering it again. "A fragrance, perhaps, that takes itself rather seriously." Back outside, Love exhaled as if purging his lungs. "So Mrs. Pettingill and Miss Swan both used the same perfume. Think she might have mixed the wrong one, sir?" "Perhaps," said Purbright. "Or perhaps someone ensured the wrong one was mixed for her." They paused under the awning of the greengrocer's to avoid a sudden shower. Across the street, Mrs. Grinnell could be seen addressing two other ladies beneath umbrellas, her gestures broad and dignified, her expression designed for civic endurance. Purbright watched the trio disperse like small committees of propriety. "Flaxborough," he said quietly, "is a town that hides its mischief under decency's skirt. Every crime here must first pass inspection for respectability." Love looked puzzled. "Meaning, sir?" "Meaning, Sergeant, that if a woman wished to humiliate another, she would choose a method polite enough to be mistaken for courtesy." Later that afternoon, they visited Mrs. Pettingill at her semi-detached house on Eglantine Avenue. The garden, predictably, overflowed with intention, roses disciplined into order, geraniums in ranks like soldiers under review. Mrs. Pettingill herself received them in a parlour crowded with embroidered cushions and conviction. "Inspector, I knew you'd come," she said, with the tragic composure of one rehearsed in being right. I told everyone there was wickedness in that hall. Miss Swan, poor soul, made enemies. Not with me, of course, though she once called my arrangements florid. Me, florid? Purbright sat, hat resting on his knee. Did you see her that afternoon? Not directly. She was fussing about the displays, as usual. I left for a moment to speak with Mrs. Grinnell. When I returned, my bouquet was desecrated. Purple, of all things. A colour for music halls and mourning. You use perfume, Mrs. Pettingill? She blinked at the oddity of the question. A dab of lilac water, nothing foreign. Though I did buy a new bottle last week, something French the chemist recommended. I found it rather too youthful. My husband said it made me smell like a confectioner's window. Would you still have it? She fetched the small bottle obligingly. Purbright took it, removed the stopper, and caught again that faint medicinal edge beneath the sweetness. He turned the bottle in his hand, and noted a slight clouding in the liquid, as though it had grown uncertain of its own nature. "May I keep this for a day or two?" he asked. "By all means, Inspector, if it helps catch whoever spoiled my display and my afternoon." As they left, Love muttered, "She's more upset about the bouquet than the corpse." "That's natural," Purbright said. "She's been tending the bouquet longer." Evening brought drizzle once more, soft as a drawn curtain. Back at the station, Purbright wrote in his neat, patient hand, "Perfume link, 2 purchasers. Possible substitution. Examine Miss Swan's bottle. Compare with Pettingill's." He sat for a while, gazing at the words, as if expecting them to confess. Love returned from the chemist's with a report. Miss Swan's bottle, retrieved from her shop, contained not the expected parfum jaune, but a different fluid altogether, paler, thinner, with a faint scent of almonds. "Almonds," Purbright repeated, tasting the word like a cautious sip. "Not the pastry sort, I imagine." "No, sir. The doctor says it could indicate cyanide derivative, used in certain dyes and old photography stuff. Not likely accidental." Purbright rose, stretching slightly. "Then someone, Sergeant, gave Miss Swan the wrong fragrance, or the right one for the wrong reasons. The question is, who needed her out of the way, and why cloak it in civility?" He walked to the window. Across the square, the lamps were coming on, smudged halos in the mist. Somewhere beyond them, Mrs. Grinnell's committee would already be drafting a letter of condolence to the local paper, something dignified yet informative, listing all the wrong lessons. Purbright's gaze lingered. "Order," he said softly, "is the veil under which small cruelties prosper. Remove it too quickly, and everyone gasps at the indecency. Remove it too slowly, and one forgets what lay beneath." Love scratched his head. "So we're after a lady with manners, a bottle, and possibly a grudge." "Indeed," Purbright said, "and in Flaxborough that should narrow the field to half the parish." He turned back to his desk and added a single line beneath his notes. "Check all perfume sales. Determine who handled Pettingill's purchase." Then, almost as an afterthought, he drew a small circle around the words purple carnation and, beneath it, wrote, "An apology. Too late or too early." The pen rested for a moment. Outside, the rain thickened, blurring the gaslight, and somewhere far off a church bell marked the hour with that unhurried confidence particular to English towns that believe themselves immune to tragedy. Purbright, watching the droplets race down the glass, was not so sure. Morning returned to Flaxborough with that air of deliberate normalcy which follows scandal the way a maid follows her mistress, pretending to notice nothing while inspecting everything. The Memorial Hall had been reopened to essential persons, which chiefly meant the caretaker, a photographer, and 2 ladies deputized by Mrs. Grinnell to ensure decency of presentation. The police presence, discreet but evident, lent the scene an almost ecclesiastical quiet. Inspector Purbright arrived shortly after 9, walking rather than driving, for the distance was small and the morning air instructive. The pavement still bore the faint, guilty scent of rain, and the shop fronts looked cleaner than truth. Passing the florist's, he noted a new display of lilies, funereal, though arranged cheerfully, and thought how quickly commerce adjusts its sympathies. Sergeant Love awaited him inside the hall, where the tables of blooms had resumed their composure. "Morning, sir. The lads took samples from the bouquet and the tablecloth. Nothing remarkable. But we found this under one of the trestles." He held up a narrow paper envelope, the sort used for invoices. On it, faintly written, were the words, "Swan, account settled." Purbright turned it in his fingers. "Any sign of handwriting comparison?" "Looks like a lady's, sir, but we can't be sure whose." "Nor what account was settled," Purbright murmured. He slipped the envelope into his pocket and began a slow circuit of the hall. His gaze paused upon the empty space where the purple carnation had been, now removed as evidence. The air there felt oddly hollow, like a stage after the play. Mrs. Grinnell entered briskly, the rustle of her skirts signaling authority restored. "Inspector, I'm relieved you've come. We are doing our best to return things to order. The ladies are terribly unsettled. I've said all along that cleanliness of conscience begins with a swept floor." Purbright inclined his head. "A sound principle, madam. May I ask, do you recall who last spoke to Miss Swan before the judging began?" Mrs. Grinnell frowned, tapping her gloves against her palm as though coaxing memory. "Not I. I was attending to the sandwiches. Possibly Mrs. Pettingill, though she was in and out. Oh, and Mrs. Wykes brought in a hymn list for the vicar. She might have passed by the cloakroom. Did anyone seem agitated?" "Agitated?" She appeared affronted by the suggestion that her committee might indulge in emotion. "Certainly not. There was some discussion about scent. Someone said the hall smelled of a French establishment, which I took to mean something continental, but then the atmosphere was unusually warm." Purbright thanked her, leaving her to supervise the moral hygiene of the tea service. As he stepped outside, Love joined him. "Sir, chemist's lad remembers something else. He says Mrs. Pettingill asked for her perfume to be a touch less sweet, so the boss mixed the vial from a stock bottle. He labeled it properly, but when he turned back to the counter, there were 2 bottles instead of 1. Could have been a mix-up." "Or a correction," Purbright said. "Perhaps Miss Swan handled her own preparation. She might have tried to improve the scent for her display and used the wrong stock." "Accident, then?" "Unlikely. Miss Swan was careful, even when interfering. Someone else handled that bottle." They walked toward the high street, where a small knot of townspeople lingered near the confectioner's window under the guise of choosing marzipan. Their conversation broke apart like crumbs as the inspector approached. A woman's laughter, quickly stifled, followed them halfway down the lane. At the millinery shop, the air was still, as though waiting for permission to breathe again. Miss Swan's apprentice, a pale girl named Nora Blee, niece to the caretaker, was dusting the counter when they entered. She looked up, startled, her hands arrested mid-polish. "Oh, Inspector, I didn't expect—" "I'm sure not," Purbright said kindly. "You're helping to keep the place tidy, I see. Your aunt and uncle must be proud." She blushed faintly. "Uncle asked me to fetch a few things for the police. Miss Swan's notebook, her order slips." She produced a small stack. Purbright leafed through them, pausing at one bearing the name Pettingill, wedding display, lace overlay. Beneath it was a penciled note, charge reduced, consultation fee waived. He raised an eyebrow. "Consultation fee?" "She, Miss Swan, helped some of the ladies choose fabric and style. She had opinions." "Was there disagreement?" The girl hesitated. "Mrs. Pettingill said she overstepped. They argued not badly, just sharp. Miss Swan said Mrs. Pettingill's taste was ambitious. Mrs. Pettingill said Miss Swan's manners were common." "Ambitious taste and common manners," Purbright repeated softly. "An old partnership." He thanked the girl and left, his mind turning over the note and the phrase account settled. By afternoon, clouds thickened again, and the inspector's office acquired that gloom which flatters thought. The laboratory report confirmed his suspicion. The perfume from Mrs. Pettingill's bottle contained traces of the same oily compound found on the silk carnation. Both, apparently, had been brushed with a faint film of resin containing prussic acid. The concentration was small, enough to sicken, perhaps kill if absorbed through the skin or inhaled. Purbright sat very still, reading the report twice. It would have been easy to dismiss the substance as accidental contamination, but Flaxborough rarely permitted accidents when vanity was available. He rose and walked to the window, watching the rain make small private channels down the glass. Below, Love was crossing the square with that purposeful clumsiness that always made him visible to anyone inclined to hide. When he entered, damp and breathless, Purbright gestured to the chair. "Sergeant, we shall invite Mrs. Pettingill to tea tomorrow at the station. Inform her politely that I wish to return her property, and ask Mrs. Grinnell to come as well. Say it concerns the committee's records." Love looked up. "You think one of them meant to poison the other, sir?" "Not meant, perhaps. But meaning is often an afterthought." He closed the report and folded his hands over it. "I believe someone attempted a genteel revenge, something that would spoil rather than destroy. But the distinction between ridicule and fatality can be delicate, especially when one dabbles with chemistry intended for youth." Love frowned. So the perfume was switched, not the flower. Both, perhaps. The flower to mark the insult, the perfume to complete it. What neither expected was that Miss Swan, in her zeal to supervise beauty, would handle the very weapon meant for humiliation. Outside, the rain deepened to a steady whisper, and the town's lamps bloomed early, trembling in the puddles like small, uncertain stars. Purbright, watching them, felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who could see the outline of a truth forming, delicate still, but growing firmer with every polite lie it displaced. The following morning broke bright and chilly, as though the weather had decided that clarity, after all, was a civic virtue. The square outside the police station glistened faintly from the night's rain, and the air carried the crisp scent of damp stone and diluted soap. Inside, Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, a single cup of tea cooling beside a file that had been arranged with the kind of order reserved for matters requiring delicate handling. The kettle in the corner burbled with domestic cheer, entirely unaware that it was hosting a small moral inquiry. Mrs. Pettingill arrived precisely on time, wrapped in an air of injured dignity and a tweed coat that had the stiffness of a uniform. Mrs. Grinnell followed not long after, her expression a model of controlled disapproval, as though she had consented to attend only out of respect for Justice's wardrobe. Sergeant Love ushered them in and stood guard near the window, trying to look both reassuring and large enough to occupy the silence. "Thank you, ladies," Purbright began pleasantly. "I appreciate your willingness to spare us a few moments. We've made progress regarding Miss Swan's unfortunate death. It appears she was poisoned. Accidentally, one hopes, though perhaps not without mischief at the root." Mrs. Pettingill gasped, hand rising to her pearls as if to prevent their confession. "Poisoned? Oh, Inspector, how dreadful. I suppose it's quite possible these foreign perfumes contain all manner of mischief. I always said they were unnecessary for a woman of character." "Indeed," Purbright replied mildly. "The poison, however, was not in the perfume itself as manufactured. It seems to have found its way there by other means." Mrs. Grinnell adjusted her gloves, a tiny squeak marking each tug. "You mean tampered with?" "I fear so," said Purbright. "Someone handled at least one of the bottles between the moment it left the chemist's counter and the time it reached its owner." Mrs. Pettingill's eyes darted to Mrs. Grinnell's face, then back to the inspector's. "I hope you don't think—" "Well, that is, I had mine in my bag until I used it that morning. Miss Swan was there. She helped me unpack the display. It's quite possible she handled it herself." "Yes," said Purbright softly. Quite possible. For a moment there was only the sound of rain dripping from the eaves outside. Then Mrs. Grinnell spoke, her tone that of a committee correcting its minutes. "Inspector, this is most distressing, but if I may say so, Edna Swan was, how shall I put it, rather too sure of her judgment. She had a way of managing people while pretending to assist them. I should think such a temperament might invite reaction." Purbright regarded her with the polite attention of a cat watching a clockwork bird. "Reaction, yes. Flaxborough, being a civilized town, prefers its quarrels domesticated. But occasionally, the trimmings of respectability conceal sharper tools." He turned slightly. "Sergeant, the item, if you please." Love produced a small paper envelope and set it upon the desk. "Found under the table at the Memorial Hall, ma'am," he said. "Your handwriting, perhaps?" Mrs. Grinnell leaned forward, frowning. "Why, yes, it's mine. That's from my notepaper, but how on earth—" "It reads Swan, account settled," Purbright said quietly. An odd expression to find discarded near her body. The color in Mrs. Grinnell's cheeks rose, then retreated like a tide that had advanced too far. "That was nothing, Inspector. I meant merely that a small misunderstanding over committee expenses had been resolved. The phrase was bookkeeping, not final." "Of course," said Purbright, his tone neutral but not entirely smooth, though one might wish words would keep to their owner's intentions. Mrs. Pettingill sat rigid, mouth slightly open, as if unwilling to trust it with her thoughts. "You can't mean that, either of us. Surely not. We may have disagreed with the woman, but we are not chemists." "Few poisoners are, Mrs. Pettingill," Purbright replied, "and those who succeed seldom mean to. Vanity, however, is a potent solvent. It dissolves prudence, sometimes even friendship." He rose, moving to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me, Mrs. Pettingill, did you handle Miss Swan's bottle at any point?" She hesitated. "Only once, Inspector, when she asked me to pass it over while she adjusted the flowers. She said something about giving the lilies a touch of freshness. I remember the smell. It was stronger than before." Purbright nodded. "And did you happen to wear gloves?" No. I must have left them with my bag." "Why?" "Because the compound we found on the bottle's stopper could be absorbed through the skin. Not instantly fatal, but unpleasant. Miss Swan's hands, however, bore the greater contact." Mrs. Grinnell's eyes widened. "Then she poisoned herself?" "Indirectly," Purbright said. "Someone tampered with that bottle, possibly intending only to embarrass or irritate. The victim, being thorough, handled the evidence too diligently." He returned to his chair and sat, studying both women with that mild patience which, in his experience, always proved less comfortable than accusation. "What I have yet to determine is whose embarrassment was intended. Mrs. Pettingill, you had your arrangement altered by that purple carnation. Whoever did so knew you'd find it vulgar. It was a jab, a small revenge, wrapped in silk." Mrs. Pettingill flushed. "Are you implying—" "I imply nothing," said Purbright gently. "But Miss Swan's apprentice reports that you accused her, quite audibly, of tampering. Perhaps she wished to return the insult in kind, something to make you blush at your own table. Or perhaps another hand used the opportunity to exchange bottles, knowing tempers ran high." He stood again, smoothing his jacket. "Ladies, we shall make a few final verifications. In the meantime, I would ask that you refrain from further speculation into public. The town's appetite for scandal is already sufficiently nourished." As Love escorted them out, Mrs. Pettingill whispered, "You'll find it's her," tilting her head toward Mrs. Grinnell. Mrs. Grinnell, without turning, murmured, "One does not accuse one's inferiors, Mrs. Pettingill. It shows poor taste." When the door closed behind them, Love let out a slow breath. "They could murder each other just by talking, sir." Purbright smiled faintly. "And perhaps they already have." He reached for the envelope once more, examining the faint indentation beneath the words "account settled." The pressure of the pen was light but deliberate, as though written by someone practicing composure while imagining judgment. He placed it beside the lab report and leaned back, eyes half closed. Outside, the square was bright with sunlight now, washing the stone facades clean of last night's gloom. Yet to Purbright's eye, every window curtain stirred with curiosity, every doorway held the faintest trace of fear. A community not guilty, perhaps, but aware that guilt was one of its native dialects. "Sergeant," he said at last, "send word to the chemist. I'd like to know who else purchased that particular scent. I've a feeling our list of ladies may not be quite complete." By midday, Purbright's request to the chemist bore fruit, or at least something of its scent. Mr. Lidicott arrived at the station himself, balancing a small ledger and his sense of importance. He was the sort of man who believed an official visit might improve both his business and his digestion. The inspector received him courteously, offering a chair that creaked with polite warning. "I thought it best to come in person, Inspector," Lidicott began. "This matter has given rise to more curiosity than I find conducive to trade. The townsfolk are, if I may say so, mistaking medicine for melodrama." "That's seldom a fatal confusion, Mr. Lidicott," said Purbright. "Please, what have you found?" The chemist opened his ledger with a flourish that suggested ecclesiastical gravity. "The Parfum Jaune line, 3 bottles sold in the last fortnight. 1 to Miss Swan, 1 to Mrs. Pettingill, and 1 to Mrs. Wykes, the organist. All from the same batch, mind you. Decanted by my assistant on Wednesday morning. None tampered with, to my knowledge." Purbright nodded slowly. "Mrs. Wykes, you say? I don't recall her mentioning it." "Likely modesty, Inspector. It's not the sort of thing one advertises. New perfume, I mean, in a town that notices such deviations as if they were blasphemies." When Lidicott had gone, humming the tune of someone relieved to have contributed but not implicated, Purbright sat for a moment, tapping the edge of his pencil against his notebook. 3 bottles, he murmured, and 1 body. That makes a ratio of inconvenience the town cannot sustain for long. Love entered with a tray of tea, sloshing slightly. "Sir, shall I ask Mrs. Wykes to come down?" "Gently, Sergeant. Tell her we're consulting her expertise in matters of fragrance. It'll sound musical." An hour later, Mrs. Wykes appeared, flurried, apologetic, and wrapped in a shawl that smelled faintly of hymn books and linseed polish. She perched on the chair's edge, hands clutching a handbag as though the law might confiscate it for questioning. "Oh, Inspector, I hardly know why I'm here. I suppose it's about poor Miss Swan. Dreadful thing. I can't seem to play the organ without thinking of her face, so composed." Purbright offered a mild smile. "You're very kind, Mrs. Wykes. We're simply trying to understand a few small details. You purchased a bottle of Parfum Jaune recently, I believe." She blinked. "Why, yes, but that was just curiosity. Mrs. Pettingill said it gave her a lift, whatever that means. I thought it might do the same for me, though Mr. Wykes prefers the smell of furniture wax." "Quite. Did you use it on the day of the flower show?" "A dab, perhaps, though I lent it briefly to Miss Swan. She said something about comparing blends, how her own seemed too heavy. I remember because she sniffed it, frowned, and said, 'This one behaves itself.' Then she laughed, rather oddly, I thought." Purbright's gaze softened. "So Miss Swan handled your bottle, as well as her own?" "I suppose so. She was always adjusting things." "Do you still have it?" Mrs. Wykes produced the bottle from her handbag, with the guilty air of a magician revealing an illicit trick. Purbright accepted it, removed the stopper, and inhaled cautiously. The scent was identical to the one found on Miss Swan. Sweet, but undercut by that faint, acrid whisper of almonds. He replaced the stopper, his tone light. "Thank you, Mrs. Wykes. That's been very helpful. I should advise you to avoid further use of this particular fragrance. The town seems to be suffering a surfeit of it." When she had gone, Love frowned at the bottle. "Same batch, same taint. That can't be accident, sir. Liddicott's swears the stock's clean." "Liddicott's honesty," said Purbright, "is as consistent as his handwriting, legible but not decorative. Still, I doubt he's our villain. Someone else handled these bottles after purchase. Miss Swan borrowed one, used another, and objected to a third. It's an intimate sort of murder, Sergeant, born in gossip, not greed." Love scratched his head. "So who meant to kill whom?" Purbright smiled faintly. "A good question, and one I intend to let them answer for themselves." That afternoon, he visited the memorial hall once more, finding it empty save for Nora Blee, the apprentice, who was polishing the brass handles of the cloakroom doors. The scent of furniture polish mingled faintly with something sharper, remnants of parfum jaune clinging stubbornly to the air. "Hard at work again, Miss Blee?" "Yes, sir. Aunt says the hall should look proper for the memorial service. Mrs. Grinnell's arranging it." "Kind of her. Did you ever see Miss Swan with Mrs. Wykes that morning?" "Oh, yes, sir. Miss Swan borrowed her powder compact. Said she'd smudged her face arranging flowers. Mrs. Wykes was flattered, I think." She paused, lowering her voice. "Miss Swan said something strange, though. She told me not to let Mrs. Pettingill near her things. Said she had a talent for confusion." Purbright looked at her closely. "Confusion is one of Flaxborough's chief industries, Miss Blee. Did she seem frightened?" "Not frightened, sir. Amused, as if she knew something nobody else did." He thanked her and stepped outside. The afternoon had dimmed, clouds hovered low and metallic, and the air smelled faintly of iron and rain. Across the square, he could see Mrs. Grinnell leaving the church, umbrella tucked neatly under one arm, her stride precise enough to measure a pavement. He watched her pause at the florist's window, where a single purple carnation had been placed in a vase labelled "In Memoriam." Purbright's eyes narrowed. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "the memorial service may be more revealing than intended. We'll attend, of course, purely as interested citizens." Love groaned. "I'll wear my best tie, sir." Purbright smiled. "That won't be necessary. In Flaxborough, grief wears its Sunday clothes even when it's only curious. Let them believe they're burying gossip. The truth has a habit of attending uninvited." He turned back toward the station, the faint aroma of artificial flowers still lingering in the wind, mingling with rain and something altogether less innocent, the sweet, deceptive trace of vanity gone rancid. The memorial service for Miss Swan was held 2 days later, under skies so pale and heavy they might have been waiting for permission to rain. The church smelled faintly of lilies and damp hymn books, and the congregation assembled with that peculiar mixture of solemnity and curiosity which only death, when safely at a distance, can inspire. The front pews were occupied by ladies of the committee, their attire a spectrum of respectable mourning from charcoal to determined mauve. Mrs. Grinnell presided over them like a matriarch of decorum, chin lifted just enough to suggest she disapproved of grief conducted without order. Inspector Purbright sat 2 rows behind, his hat resting on his knee, his eyes moving with the patient rhythm of a clock pendulum. Beside him, Sergeant Love wrestled with his hymn sheet as if it were resisting arrest. From the pulpit, the vicar delivered a eulogy that managed to be both affectionate and careful. Miss Swan, he said, had brought beauty to her fellow citizens and, if sometimes misunderstood, had never been found wanting in energy. At this, several heads nodded as though energy were an inconvenient form of righteousness. When the organ struck the first hymn, the sound wavered slightly, like breath caught on hesitation. Mrs. Wykes, pale and perspiring under the gallery lamp, played with meticulous sorrow. The scent of lilies mingled with a trace of something sharper, floral but metallic, the unmistakable whisper of parfum jaune. Purbright noticed it, faint but persistent, and saw Mrs. Pettingill glance toward the organist's loft with visible distaste. After the final hymn, the congregation moved out in pairs, like mourners leaving a theatre performance of moral instruction. Outside, the air felt oddly lighter, though rain had begun to fall in fine, hesitant lines. Purbright lingered near the lich gate, greeting Mrs. Grinnell and Mrs. Pettingill as they emerged together, their proximity less cooperation than choreography. "A lovely service," Mrs. Grinnell said, her voice brisk as a broom. The vicar spoke very fittingly, though perhaps with too much emphasis on Miss Swan's industrious nature. It gives the wrong impression of repose. "Indeed," Purbright replied. One might almost imagine he feared she would start rearranging the flowers. Mrs. Pettingill gave a short, shocked laugh, then recovered herself. "Inspector, do you suppose there will be further inquiries? The town does so hate uncertainty." "There always are, madam," Purbright said kindly. "Uncertainty keeps a community from becoming complacent. Besides, it's our local form of recreation." He watched them move away beneath their umbrellas, speaking in low, pointed voices that seemed to underline every word. Behind them, Mrs. Wykes appeared, her face ashen. She clutched a handkerchief in one gloved hand and a small bouquet in the other. When she saw Purbright, she hesitated. "Inspector," she began, her voice quivering, "there's something I feel I ought to tell you. It's been troubling me since that day at the hall." Purbright inclined his head, stepping aside from the dripping gate-post. "Go on, Mrs. Wykes." "It's about the perfume," she whispered. "After Miss Swan, after she collapsed, I realized I still had my bottle in my handbag. But when I looked later, it wasn't the same. The label was smudged and the stopper slightly different. I thought perhaps I'd mixed them up. I didn't want to seem foolish." "Where is it now?" "At home. I've not touched it since. It smells stronger, wrong somehow." Purbright's tone remained calm, but his eyes brightened slightly. "Would you allow Sergeant Love to collect it this afternoon?" She nodded eagerly. "Of course. I only want to put the matter right." As she moved off down the lane, Purbright turned to watch the dwindling group of mourners. Mrs. Grinnell and Mrs. Pettingill were speaking to the vicar, both gesturing delicately, like ladies fencing with good manners. The inspector observed their faces, their controlled sympathy, their subtle battle for the final word. It struck him that neither woman was mourning Edna Swan, so much as vindicating herself against her. Back at the station later that afternoon, the scent of damp clothing and old paper replaced that of lilies. Love arrived with the bottle in a brown paper bag, which he set carefully on the inspector's desk. "She wasn't wrong, sir. The stopper's newer than the one from the other samples, and there's a faint chip round the rim, like it's been changed." Purbright uncapped it, waved it once beneath his nose, and immediately stoppered it again. "Yes, our old friend Almond. Whoever handled this has a steady hand and a poor imagination. They thought to remove suspicion by returning the wrong bottle to the right handbag. So Mrs. Wykes was supposed to... Not necessarily. I doubt anyone planned for so many hands to pass over the same scent. But vanity breeds confusion. Perhaps the bottle meant for Mrs. Pettingill found its way to Miss Swan, or vice versa. A social revenge conducted in the language of fragrances." Love frowned. "And Mrs. Grinnell?" Purbright smiled faintly. "She writes memoranda. Sergeant, not murder. But she knows the value of silence. Still, she was present when the keys were borrowed and when the exhibits were arranged. If poison was applied, she provided the opportunity, even if not the motive." He leaned back, folding his hands. "It's all very Flaxborough, isn't it? A death born not of passion, but of propriety. Someone sought to make a point, and the point pricked deeper than intended." The telephone rang, interrupting the stillness. Love answered, listening for a moment before covering the receiver. "Dr. Hilling, sir. He's got the full report. Says he's found skin irritation on Miss Swan's hands, consistent with direct contact. More than accidental. Purbright nodded. Tell him I'll call shortly, and send a note to Mrs. Grinnell. Politely invite her to the station again tomorrow morning. I should like her opinion on the virtues of coordination. When Love had gone, the inspector stood by the window. The square outside was slick and glistening, its puddles mirroring small, distorted halos of lamplight. Through one of them he saw Nora Blee hurrying past with a parcel, head bowed against the drizzle. She had the determined gait of someone accustomed to carrying other people's errands and their secrets. He watched until she vanished round the corner, then turned back to the table where the bottle of Parfum Jaune sat gleaming faintly under the desk lamp. Its golden label caught the light, but beneath the surface the liquid moved sluggishly, clouded and deceptive. It seemed, he thought, a perfect emblem for the town itself, pleasant enough to look at until shaken. He reached for his notebook and wrote a single line. 1 bottle, 3 hands, 1 mistake too many. Then, after a pause, he added, Tomorrow the truth will be politely requested. The morning arrived with a thin light that turned the mist over the river to silver gauze. Inspector Purbright walked to the station with a certain deliberate ease, the kind of pace that suggested a man allowing his thoughts to arrange themselves before company arrived. The air smelled faintly of soap, horsehair, and the coal fires of early risers. He nodded to the milkman, exchanged a quiet "good morning" with the baker's wife, and by the time he reached his office, his mind was as neat as the desk he found waiting for him. Mrs. Grinnell presented herself at 10:30, punctual as propriety itself. She was dressed in a dark grey ensemble of self-respect, her gloves immaculate, her handbag the size and shape of a moral verdict. Sergeant Love showed her in, then withdrew at Purbright's nod, though not far enough to miss what might be useful. Mrs. Grinnell, Purbright began pleasantly. Thank you for coming. You'll forgive the interruption, but a few matters remain unsettled. Small details, yet they trouble me. Of course, Inspector, she replied, taking the offered chair. If there is any service I can perform for the cause of clarity, I'm always at the disposal of justice. Indeed, justice and order so rarely part company in Flaxborough. He smiled, mild but watchful. We've been reviewing events at the Memorial Hall. I understand you oversaw access to the committee cupboard where the spare keys were kept. That's correct. I always believed such things should be centralized. It avoids, well, misunderstandings. Quite so. And the key Miss Swan used to open the hall on the morning of her death, did she collect it from you personally? Mrs. Grinnell hesitated, ever so slightly. No, she sent that young girl, Miss Blee, I think, to borrow it on her behalf. I approved it naturally. Miss Swan had the committee's trust, even if she occasionally presumed upon it. Purbright inclined his head. A practical arrangement, and you had, of course, seen her the previous evening during the preparations? Yes. She stayed rather late, fussing with the arrangements. I reminded her the caretaker needed to lock up. She said she would finish and leave the key under the vase in the vestibule. Did she? To my knowledge, yes. Purbright paused, folding his hands. Mrs. Grinnell, do you recall the purple carnation that appeared in Mrs. Pettingill's display? She blinked. How could anyone forget? Such vulgarity. It undermined the entire tone of the exhibition. I suppose it might have felt like an intrusion, an insult even. Precisely so. She caught herself. That is, well, it was in the poorest taste. Of course. You wouldn't happen to know who provided that flower. I certainly do not. I've never entered the florists in my life without purpose. Purbright smiled faintly, though his eyes didn't join in. That's a rare discipline in this town. He rose, crossed to a small cabinet, and removed a paper envelope, the one found beneath the trestle table. I must trouble you once more. This note was written on your stationery, was it not? Mrs. Grinnell's posture stiffened. It was, yes. I explained before, an internal note, entirely innocent. Indeed. And the phrase account settled, that too was innocent? She met his gaze. Completely. A trivial committee matter, Inspector. Purbright regarded her for a moment, then laid the envelope gently on the desk, alongside the chemist's ledger he had borrowed. You see, Mrs. Grinnell, we now know that 3 bottles of the same perfume were sold. 1 to you. She blinked again, slower this time. To me? Yes. Paid for in cash 2 days before Miss Swan's death. The chemist remembers you very clearly, your remark about preferring a scent that suggests dignity rather than daring. His words, not mine. A faint flush rose in her cheeks, though her voice remained steady. It was merely an experiment. The fragrance was too youthful. I never used it. Strange, Purbright said softly, because the residue we found on the carnation bore traces of the same scent, and your fingerprints, faint but present, were on the paper wrapping beneath the exhibit table. For the first time, she faltered. Inspector, are you implying that I'm not implying anything, he interrupted gently. But I am suggesting that you, perhaps, tried to moderate the more flamboyant behavior of your committee through subtle correction. You might have wished to teach Mrs. Pettingill a lesson in restraint, something mildly humiliating, nothing more. That is absurd, she said sharply, though the word trembled. Why would I risk such impropriety? Because, Purbright said, leaning forward slightly, you didn't realize the perfume had been altered. Someone else, perhaps Miss Swan herself, perhaps that bright young apprentice of hers, tampered with it, thinking only to make it distinctive. You meant to inconvenience vanity, not end a life. But vanity, he added softly, is a clumsy accomplice. Mrs. Grinnell's composure, long rehearsed, seemed to sag by inches. You have no proof, she whispered. No, he said kindly. Only a pattern. But patterns in small towns are more reliable than fingerprints. People behave as they always have. You saw a woman competing for influence, and you sought to remind her of proportion. Unfortunately, Miss Swan's curiosity intervened. She handled what wasn't hers. The room fell silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Then Mrs. Grinnell spoke again, her voice thin as sewing thread. It was meant as a jest, a correction. Miss Swan, mocked Mrs. Pettingill's taste to my face. She said vulgarity was the only thing left with confidence. I wanted her to learn humility, not die for it. Purbright inclined his head slowly. I believe you. She looked up, startled. Then, but belief, he added, is not exoneration. The matter will be reviewed. The coroner will require your statement, and I expect he will find comfort in your candor. Mrs. Grinnell rose, every motion deliberate, as though reclaiming her dignity from the air around her. Flaxborough must never hear of this, she said faintly. Flaxborough, Purbright replied, always hears, but it seldom listens for long. When she had gone, Love reappeared, a hesitant figure in the doorway. You think she meant it, sir? That it was only meant to embarrass? Purbright poured himself a small cup of tea, watching the steam curl like a quiet ghost. Oh, she meant it, Sergeant. Every word, every gesture. But meaning is a complicated thing. The harm we do in earnest is rarely as fatal as the harm we do politely. He set the cup down and opened the window. Outside, the mist was lifting, revealing the tidy roofs and narrow lanes of a town returning to its routines. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell began to strike the half-hour, calm and indifferent. Flaxborough, he thought, would fold this story neatly into its collection of moral parables, and before long its citizens would find comfort in thinking the lesson had been learned by someone else. The coroner's inquiry took place the next day in the small, oak-panelled courtroom adjoining the town hall. The benches were filled before the hour, and the air had that faint blend of starch, paper, and curiosity that passed in Flaxborough for civic gravity. A reporter from the Flaxborough Chronicle sharpened his pencil with unnecessary violence, and several ladies of the committee had come expressly to ensure that whatever version of events emerged would be the one most flattering to collective virtue. Inspector Purbright, seated discreetly near the rear, watched the proceedings with an expression of calm benevolence. Beside him, Sergeant Love occupied himself by identifying the attendees under his breath. Mrs. Grinnell, front row. Mrs. Pettingill behind her, trying not to look pleased. Mrs. Wykes, 2 tissues already, and the caretaker sweating like he's on trial himself. The coroner, Mr. Greaves, was a precise man with the patient dignity of someone frequently bored but seldom surprised. He began by summarizing the facts in an even voice. Miss Edna Swan, aged 52 of Fountain Lane, was found deceased at the Memorial Hall on the 21st of May. No evidence of assault or theft. Cause of death, respiratory failure brought on by contact with a toxic compound, later identified as a cyanogenic resin. The compound was traced to a perfume bottle and an artificial flower found among the exhibits. Mrs. Wykes was called first. Trembling, she testified to her brief lending of perfume and her later discovery that her own bottle had been tampered with. Her account was hesitant but sincere, and the coroner's questions drew from her the image of an innocent woman caught in the slipstream of more confident personalities. Mrs. Pettingill followed, tearful at the appropriate intervals, explaining how her bouquet had been perverted by mischief. She denied touching the perfume herself, but admitted to using a dab on the wrist that morning, as one does, Inspector, for confidence. When Mrs. Grinnell's turn came, the room seemed to inhale collectively. She rose, stately as a monument, and took her oath with composed hands. Her answers were crisp, her memory selective but not entirely uncooperative. She acknowledged writing the note found under the table but insisted it bore no sinister meaning. When asked whether she had ever handled any of the perfumes, she smiled thinly. I may have moved a bottle while tidying the committee's display area, but I cannot say whose it was. Purbright noted how her gloved fingers tightened on the witness rail. The coroner's brow furrowed slightly, but he pressed no further, content to let her dignity defend her. Dr. Hilling, summoned next, described the poison with clinical detachment. An accidental absorption would require prolonged contact, he said. The deceased likely handled the contaminated object repeatedly, perhaps unconsciously. The toxin entered through the skin. When all statements were heard, Mr. Greaves leaned back, spectacles perched on his nose. The jury will consider, he said, whether Miss Swan's death was the result of deliberate malice, negligence, or misadventure. The evidence suggests carelessness with a dangerous substance, but no clear intention to harm. In this court, we deal with causes, not motives. Purbright rose as the murmurs began to spread through the hall. The verdict, death by misadventure, was delivered 15 minutes later. It satisfied nobody completely, but offended no one beyond repair, which in Flaxborough passed for success. Outside, the crowd dispersed into tidy clusters of opinion. Mrs. Pettingill declared herself vindicated, Mrs. Wykes faintly heroic, and Mrs. Grinnell preserved a silence so deliberate it seemed designed for quotation. Purbright and Love walked slowly toward the square, where the afternoon sun had broken through, softening even the stone facades into something almost forgiving. "Well," Love said, "that's that then. No charges, no villain, no headlines worth the ink." "On the contrary, Sergeant," said Purbright quietly. "Every town likes its tragedies to have an aftertaste of decency. We've provided one." They stopped outside the florist's, where the window display had changed again, a modest arrangement of white carnations with a single purple bloom in the center. The card read, "In memory of Flaxborough's best intentions." Purbright regarded it thoughtfully. "She knows," Love muttered. "Possibly," said Purbright. "Or possibly she's reminding us that flowers, like people, bloom according to temperament, not rule." They walked on. At the station, a letter awaited him, neat, unsigned, its handwriting unmistakably Grinnell's. Inspector, it read, I trust the matter may now rest. There are occasions when too much truth does less good than enough discretion. Let Flaxborough learn quietly, as it always has. Purbright folded it once and slipped it into his drawer. For a long moment he sat looking at the window, where the sunlight trembled on the glass like something uncertain of its welcome. Love returned with tea and 2 stale biscuits. Funny sort of case, sir. Nobody evil, nobody innocent. That's the difficulty of civilization, Sergeant. It removes the convenience of villains. He sipped his tea, grimaced faintly, and added, We shall leave it at that. Mrs. Grinnell will retire from her committees for a while. Mrs. Pettingill will enjoy feeling wronged. Mrs. Wykes will pray for guidance, and the rest of Flaxborough will behave as though scandal were a form of exercise. Love grinned. And you, sir? I shall write a short note to the Home Office explaining that order has been restored. That, after all, is our business. Not truth, not morality, but order. The truth, he added softly, will keep. He turned to his papers, and the quiet of late afternoon settled over the room, steady, dutiful, and faintly melancholic, like the town itself. Outside, the clock in the square struck 4. Flaxborough, soothed by routine, resumed its ordinary pulse, its lace curtains once more drawn against curiosity. But beneath the tidy hum of respectability lingered the faint, sweet trace of parfum jaune, drifting from some forgotten scrap of cloth, a reminder that nothing in Flaxborough ever vanished completely, only faded until it could be spoken of politely again. The rain came back that evening, soft and unhurried, rinsing the square as though the town were being gently scolded for its behavior. In the police station, the light from Purbright's lamp made a warm pool across the desk, touching the neat ranks of files, a teacup gone cold, and the single bottle of parfum jaune that still sat like an uninvited guest. He had not sent it to the laboratory again. The case was closed, officially. Yet it remained there, its faint golden shimmer teasing at the corner of his thoughts. He heard the door open and after a moment's pause, Sergeant Love's careful tread. "Letter for you, sir," Love said. "From the chemist's lad. He's found something odd in the ledger. Thought you'd want to see." Purbright took the note. It was short, written in the uncertain hand of youth. "Sir, you asked about the perfume sale. I remembered there was a 4th bottle. Sold it cash to Miss Blee, the apprentice at Miss Swan's. Said it was for practice display. Didn't write it down proper because she paid small change and hurried off. Thought it best you knew." Purbright read it twice, quietly. The sound of the rain filled the silence between them. Then he rose, took his hat from the peg, and said, "Come along, Sergeant. There's one last courtesy call to be made." They found Nora Blee at the millinery shop, closing early against the weather. She looked up, startled, when the inspector entered, but recovered quickly, folding her polishing cloth with nervous care. "Oh, Inspector, I didn't expect—" "No one ever does," Purbright said mildly. "You've been very helpful these past days. There's only one small matter left. You bought a bottle of perfume recently, didn't you?" "Same kind as Miss Swan's." She hesitated, then nodded. "It was only for practice. Miss Swan said I ought to learn presentation. She wanted me to prepare a small window display. Modern, she said." "Did she ask you to alter any of the bottles?" Nora's eyes flickered, the smallest betrayal of memory. "Not exactly. She said the scent needed distinction, that the town was too dull for subtlety. She showed me how to add a little essence from another bottle, something sharper. She said it was just oil, harmless." "But it wasn't harmless," Purbright said softly. "It was a cosmetic compound the chemist kept in unlabeled stock, a fixative that happens to contain cyanide resin. When you helped her that night, you may have used it without knowing." Nora's face drained of color. I didn't mean... Oh, Inspector, I didn't know. She said it would make the fragrance last longer. I only did what she told me. Purbright's voice was gentle. I believe you. And when she died, you realized what you'd done, or thought you had, and you panicked. You tried to put the bottle back in someone else's bag, to make it look as though it had passed through too many hands to trace. She nodded once, tears starting. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted it to stop. Love shifted awkwardly, looking at the ceiling. Purbright remained still, watching her with something that might have been pity. You did stop it, he said quietly. You stopped it where it began, with vanity and imitation. You were careless, not cruel. She pressed a handkerchief to her face. Will there be trouble, sir? There's always trouble, Purbright said, but not always guilt. You'll tell the truth to the coroner if called again, and then you'll go on. Perhaps find a place where hats don't carry such heavy responsibilities. Outside, the rain had thickened to a steady curtain. Love followed him into the street, silent for a while before saying, So it wasn't Mrs. Grinnell or Mrs. Pettingill after all. Oh, it was, said Purbright mildly, in spirit if not in act. They brewed the potion, the girl only spilled it. Flaxborough's poison is always social before it's chemical. They stopped under the lamplight. The square was nearly empty, save for a few shop windows glowing like aquariums of polite normality. Purbright looked around at the damp respectability of it all and sighed. It's a tidy ending, Sergeant. Nobody wicked, nobody wise, just the proper amount of regret. Will you tell them? No. The dead woman's pride killed her, and the living have learned nothing they'll admit. Better to leave them their story. The truth would only spoil its symmetry. They walked on, their footsteps softened by the wet cobbles. At the corner, Purbright paused, turning once more toward the darkened windows of the milliner's shop. A faint light still glowed inside, and for a moment he thought he could smell that same elusive sweetness, the perfume that had promised youth, confidence, and charm, and delivered something very English instead, embarrassment, remorse, and the quiet necessity of carrying on. Come along, love, he said. There's paperwork to be done, and the rain won't last forever. Sir. Yes. Do you ever think people here might stop finding trouble for themselves? Purbright smiled, his eyes on the misty lamps. If they did, Sergeant, Flaxborough would cease to exist, and then what would become of us? They walked into the drizzle together, two small figures against the glow of orderly windows, their conversation dissolving into the hush of the rain. Somewhere, far behind them, the church clock began to strike the hour, each chime softening into the next until even time itself seemed reluctant to disturb the peace.